Tom Henderson sat at the window with his third cup of coffee, scowling at the sight across the fence. The Johnsons were putting up Halloween decorations, a blow-up ghost, plastic pumpkins, and fake cobwebs stretched across the porch railings. Marcus Johnson stood on a ladder, untangling strings of orange lights, while his two kids, Tyler and Zoe, ran through the yard, giggling as they chased each other with plastic bats. Tom's hand gripped his coffee mug so tightly that it rattled against the saucer. "This is exactly what I warned them about," Tom muttered to himself, glancing at the Neighborhood Association handbook on his desk. Inappropriate seasonal decor. The Johnsons had lived next door for only 2 months, and already, Tom felt like the peace of the neighborhood was slipping through his fingers. Tom used to be proud of how orderly the neighborhood was. Every lawn trimmed, every driveway swept clean. He liked to imagine himself as the unofficial guardian of the community's standards. But the Johnsons were disrupting everything. Not with loud parties or fights, but with something far worse in Tom's eyes: joy. Their laughter, their warm smiles, their lively energy. None of it fit Tom's rigid idea of what his suburban bubble should be. He drained the last of his coffee and slammed the cup on the counter. He'd had enough. Something had to be done. Later that afternoon, Tom taped a folded note to the Johnsons' door. It was anonymous, as always. "Your decorations are excessive and not in line with the neighborhood's aesthetics," it read. "Please remove them within 48 hours to avoid further complaints." He stepped back and surveyed his work, a small smirk forming on his face. He still had control, if only a little. That evening, Denise Johnson found the note and showed it to her husband. Marcus exhaled through his nose, shaking his head as he read it. "Seriously? Just ignore it, babe," Denise said, folding the paper neatly and tossing it into the trash. "We knew we'd deal with people like him when we moved here. It's nothing new." Marcus clenched his jaw. "It's not right. I'll try to be polite, but that guy..." He trailed off, glancing toward the house next door. Tom's curtains twitched slightly. He was watching, like he always did. "Let it go," Denise insisted, gently touching Marcus's arm. "We're not here to fight. We're here to build a life for our kids. Don't let him steal that from us." Marcus nodded slowly, though it took all his restraint to keep calm. "Fine, but I'm not letting him ruin our Halloween." 2 days later, the decorations were still up, even more of them now. Tom's jaw tightened as he saw a plastic skeleton hanging from the Johnsons' porch. His fingers itched to send another note, but this time he had a better plan. He picked up the phone and dialed the Homeowners Association. "Yes, I'd like to file a complaint," he said, tapping his foot impatiently. "Yes, it's about the new family on Maple Drive. Their decorations are inappropriate, totally out of line with the neighborhood standards. And another thing, they've got their kids running wild. It's disruptive." After hanging up, Tom sat back in his recliner, satisfied. He knew how these things worked. Enough complaints, and the association would put pressure on the family. They'd either conform or leave. But as the days passed, the decorations remained. And worse, the Johnsons didn't seem the least bit bothered by his efforts. They waved at him cheerfully whenever they saw him, even after the complaints and the notes. It was infuriating. A week later, things escalated. Tom spotted Marcus working on something in the backyard, a small structure rising behind the fence. His heart raced. An unpermitted addition. This was exactly the kind of thing he could use. Tom snapped pictures with his phone, feeling a surge of vindictive excitement. He wasted no time filing a report with the city. "They've built an illegal extension," he told the city inspector over the phone, his voice brimming with satisfaction. "No permits, no approval. It's completely against code." 3 days later, a city inspector arrived at the Johnsons' house. Tom watched from his window, arms crossed, as the inspector walked around the property with Marcus. He could practically taste the victory. They would be fine. They would finally understand that people like them didn't belong here. But then the unthinkable happened. Marcus and the inspector shook hands, laughed even. Tom squinted, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Later that evening, Tom found Marcus standing at the shared fence, casually raking leaves. "Evening, Tom," Marcus called, his voice calm and pleasant. Tom's scowl deepened. "What the hell was that all about today?" he snapped, unable to hide his frustration. Marcus leaned on the rake, wiping his brow with the back of his hand. "Oh, that?" The inspector said everything's fine. Turns out the little structure in the back is just a shed, well within code. Tom's face burned with humiliation. "You got lucky," he muttered, retreating toward his front door. Marcus's voice followed him. "Or maybe you just assumed the worst, Tom. Ever think about that?" Tom didn't respond. He slammed the door behind him, furious, not just at Marcus, but at himself. His usual tricks weren't working. The Johnsons weren't backing down. And for the first time in a long while, Tom felt powerless. That night, Tom sat alone in his dimly lit living room, surrounded by unopened bills. The truth was closing in on him. He'd been hiding his financial problems for years. Maxed out credit cards, unpaid property taxes, and foreclosure threats piling up like dead leaves. He was hanging on by a thread, clinging to the only thing that gave him a sense of control: his house and the illusion of superiority over his new neighbors. But now, even though it was slipping away, and deep down, Tom knew it was only a matter of time before everything collapsed. Tom stood at the mailbox, flipping through bills with a pit in his stomach. Overdue. Final notice. Immediate action required. The bright red warnings blared at him from every envelope, but he stuffed them back into the mailbox with trembling hands, hoping the neighbors wouldn't notice. They couldn't know. Across the street, Denise Johnson was watering her garden, her 2 kids playing tag nearby. When she saw Tom by the mailbox, she gave him a friendly wave. He pretended not to notice, turning his back sharply and heading inside. He couldn't afford friendliness, not with them. Inside, Tom leaned against the door, breathing heavily. Everything was catching up to him. He'd been dodging bills, avoiding phone calls from creditors, and pushing off reality for too long. The eviction notice had been the final blow, but he wasn't ready to admit defeat. Not yet. Later that day, he spotted Marcus pulling into the driveway, unloading groceries from the back of his car. Tom stood by his window, watching with clenched fists. How could they afford so much? A new car, groceries in bulk, holiday decorations. It was a luxury Tom hadn't enjoyed in years. Show-offs, he muttered under his breath, trying to act like they belong. Suddenly, Marcus glanced toward Tom's window. For a brief moment, their eyes met. Tom flinched, stepping back, the curtains swaying slightly from his movement. Caught again. The following morning, Tom saw a letter taped to his own door. At first, his heart stopped. Was this the final eviction notice? But as he unfolded the paper, his face twisted with confusion. It wasn't from the bank or the city. It was from Marcus Johnson. "Hey Tom," it read. "We noticed your front lawn hasn't been mowed for a while. If you're too busy, I'd be happy to take care of it for you. No charge. Just being neighborly." Tom stared at the note in disbelief, feeling his face grow hot with anger. What kind of game were they playing? He crumpled the paper in his hand and threw it across the room. They weren't going to humiliate him like this. A few days later, Marcus knocked on Tom's door. For a long moment, Tom sat frozen in his armchair, refusing to answer. But Marcus knocked again, more insistent this time. "Tom, I know you're in there," Marcus called through the door. His voice was calm, but firm. "I just wanted to talk. Nothing serious. Just neighbors, okay?" Tom's jaw clenched. He hated this. Hated the way Marcus spoke, as if they were equals. As if he could stroll over here with his kindness and pretend there wasn't a gaping canyon between them. Reluctantly, Tom opened the door just a crack. "What do you want?" he barked. Marcus smiled politely. "Just thought I'd offer again. If you need help with the lawn or anything else, let me know." "No pressure." Tom scoffed. "I don't need your help." Marcus raised an eyebrow, but didn't argue. "Fair enough. Just figured I'd ask. Take care, Tom." He gave a small nod and walked back toward his house. No anger, no sarcasm, just kindness. And somehow, that made Tom feel even worse. He slammed the door shut and leaned against it, seething with frustration. The following week, things went from bad to worse. A letter arrived from the bank, and this time, there was no mistaking the message. Tom had 30 days to vacate the property or the sheriff's office would handle the eviction. Tom sat at his kitchen table, staring at the letter, his hands shaking. 30 days. It was all slipping through his fingers. Everything he'd built, everything he'd fought to keep gone. He ran his hand through his thinning hair, feeling the weight of all the lies he'd told himself over the years. This house was his last piece of dignity. Without it, who was he? Just a bitter old man with nothing to show for his life. And now, he couldn't even take comfort in his misguided war against the Johnsons. They weren't the problem. He was. That night, Tom sat in front of his computer, trying to figure out what had gone wrong. He logged into his mortgage account, heart pounding. And then he saw it. The property had been sold. His stomach twisted in disbelief. He scrolled through the documents, his vision blurring with rage. The house had been sold without his knowledge, but that wasn't the worst part. The new owner was Marcus Johnson. Tom stared at the screen, his pulse hammering in his ears. How could this have happened? Had Marcus been planning this all along? Was this some elaborate scheme to take everything from him? The next morning, Tom stormed out of his house and marched straight to the Johnsons' front door. He wasn't going down without a fight. He pounded on the door with a clenched fist, not caring who heard. Marcus opened the door, calm as ever. "Morning, Tom." Tom shoved a printout of the property's sale into Marcus's chest. "What the hell is this?" he demanded, his voice shaking with rage. Marcus glanced down at the paper, then back at Tom. "It's exactly what it looks like. We bought the house." Tom's eyes burned with humiliation. "Why? What kind of sick joke is this?" Marcus sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "It's not a joke, Tom. We knew the bank was planning to sell it off cheap. Thought it was better if we bought it than someone else." Tom's mouth opened, but no words came out. He had nothing left to fight with. No power, no control, just shame. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Tom's breathing was ragged, his hands trembling. Finally, Marcus broke the silence. "We're not trying to humiliate you, Tom, but you've made things pretty hard on us since we got here. We could have ignored you, could have taken the high road, but instead, Marcus folded his arms, looking Tom square in the eye. "We decided to help." Tom's anger fizzled, leaving behind only exhaustion. They had beaten him with kindness. "You've got 30 days, Marcus added, his tone matter-of-fact but not unkind. "We'll give you a fair timeline to find somewhere else. No hard feelings. If you want, we can even help you move." Tom swallowed hard, the lump in his throat nearly choking him. They had every right to be smug, but instead, they offered help. Help he didn't deserve. I'll figure it out," Tom muttered, turning on his heel. As he walked back to his house, Marcus called after him. "Offer's still open, Tom. Just let us know." Tom didn't look back. He couldn't. He was too humiliated, too broken. And for the first time, he realized that he had no one to blame but himself. Tom sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the stack of unopened bills on his nightstand. 30 days. That's all he had left before his house. His last sense of pride would no longer be his. He ran his hands over his face, feeling the weight of his failures settle into his bones. There was no way out now. He'd lost control of his life, and the Johnsons had seen it happen firsthand. Nothing could be worse than being pitted by the people he despised. The humiliation gnawed at him, day and night. Every time he stepped outside, there they were, Marcus, Denise, and their kids, kind, polite, and unbothered by his hostility. The worst part was how genuine their kindness seemed. They weren't trying to rub his failure in his face. They just lived, and that was something Tom could hardly stomach. He felt trapped, not just by the foreclosure notice or the dwindling days, but by the shame of realizing he'd made enemies out of people who had only tried to help. His bitterness had turned inward, festering like an infection with no cure. The following week, Tom's anxiety grew unbearable. What was he supposed to do next? He couldn't move to another house. He had no savings. The idea of living in an apartment made his skin crawl. He belonged here, or at least he had. But now, he was the man with no place, no allies, and no future. He sat in his recliner, a half-empty bottle of whiskey on the coffee table, when a knock at the door startled him. Tom froze, hoping whoever it was would just leave. But the knock came again, soft, unhurried. With a groan, he pulled himself to his feet and opened the door. Marcus stood on the porch, wearing his usual calm expression, though his eyes held a trace of concern. "Evening, Tom," Marcus said, resting his hands in his pockets. Tom sighed heavily, bracing himself for some sanctimonious offer of help. What now? You come and tell me how lucky I am that you bought my house. Marcus shook his head. No, nothing like that. Look, I know things have been rough for you. He hesitated, as if choosing his next words carefully. I've been there too, man. Maybe not in the same way, but I know what it feels like to lose control. Tom glared at him. I didn't ask for your sympathy. Marcus nodded slowly. Fair enough, but I'm not here to rub anything in your face. I came to tell you something I think you deserve to hear. Tom crossed his arms. Spit it out. Marcus took a breath. The reason I bought your house? I know what the bank's foreclosure process looks like. If they sold it to someone else, you'd be out in a week, no warning. I figured this way, at least we could give you time. Tom stared at him, stunned. He hadn't expected this. You've got the full 30 days, like the bank said. But if you need more time, Marcus added, we can figure something out. I'm not here to make this harder for you, Tom. Tom opened his mouth, but no words came. Why would someone he had treated so badly go out of their way to help him? It didn't make sense. As the days passed, Tom began to notice small changes within himself. The anger that had once consumed him started to weaken, replaced by something far more uncomfortable: regret. He found himself replaying every cold interaction, every petty complaint, every hostile note he'd left. All of it seemed so pointless now. One morning, he sat at his dining table, staring out the window as Marcus and his son, Tyler, played catch in their yard. They were happy, in spite of everything Tom had done. Watching them, he realized how absurd it was to have resented them for something as simple as enjoying life. He thought about Marcus's offer, an open hand, despite everything. It was more than Tom would have ever done for someone like him. And that was the most painful part of all, realizing that the Johnsons were better people than he had ever been willing to be. One afternoon, Tyler ran over to Tom's fence, holding a football under his arm. Hi, Mr. Henderson, the boy called cheerfully. Tom glanced up from the rake he'd been using to clear the leaves from his yard. What do you want, kid? He muttered, though the edge in his voice had dulled. Want to play with us? Tyler asked, grinning. For a moment, Tom was stunned by the offer. Why would this kid invite him, of all people, to play? He opened his mouth to refuse, out of habit, mostly, but the words didn't come. Instead, he heard himself say, maybe next time. Tyler shrugged. Okay, just let me know. He waved and ran back to his dad. Tom stood there, rake in hand, feeling something strange settle in his chest, something almost like warmth. It was the first time in years that anyone had invited him to do anything. And it came from the boy next door, the same boy whose family he had spent months trying to drive away. As his final week in the house approached, Tom's emotions became a tangled mess. He was no longer just bitter or angry, he was ashamed. And yet, the Johnsons never stopped being kind. They waved every morning, offered help whenever they saw him struggling. And even Tyler's invitation remained open. One evening, Denise knocked on Tom's door. I brought some extra lasagna, she said, handing over a foil-wrapped dish. Figured you could use a decent meal. Tom stared at the dish in disbelief. He didn't deserve their kindness, not after everything he'd done. But he accepted it anyway, mumbling a thank you as he closed the door. On the final day, the moving truck arrived. Tom stood in his empty living room, feeling hollow as he looked around. This was the end. Everything he had fought to hold onto was gone. As he carried the last box to the truck, Marcus approached him. Need a hand? Marcus asked. Tom hesitated, then shook his head. No, I got it. Marcus nodded, but before Tom could turn away, he spoke again. Tom, I meant what I said. If you need anything, help finding a place, whatever it is, just let me know. We're neighbors. Even if you're moving. Tom swallowed hard, the lump in his throat almost choking him. It was the kindest thing anyone had said to him in years. Thanks, he whispered, his voice barely audible. Marcus gave a small, understanding smile. Take care of yourself, Tom. Tom nodded, blinking back tears as he climbed into the truck. As he pulled away from the house, he felt something shift inside him. A small but undeniable change. For the first time in a long while, Tom didn't feel consumed by bitterness. He felt something closer to hope. Maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to be better. And with that thought, he drove toward his uncertain future, carrying not just his belongings, but a newfound understanding. Kindness could defeat even the deepest anger, and sometimes the hardest person to forgive is yourself. The days after Tom's move were marked by an unsettling quiet. He had rented a small one-bedroom apartment a few miles away, the cheapest he could find. The walls were thin, the floors creaked, and the neighbors were mostly young people who didn't bother with greetings or small talk. It was everything Tom hated. He sat in a cheap folding chair by the window, staring out at a parking lot instead of the familiar front lawns and tidy sidewalks of his old neighborhood. He'd lost everything that mattered. And for what? His bitterness? His pride? He kept telling himself that the move was temporary, that he'd find a way back to a real house. But deep down, he knew that wasn't true. There were no more houses, no more fresh starts, not for someone like him. He was too old, too broke, and too alone. A week later, Tom was pushing a cart through the grocery store, checking off the few items he could afford. As he turned down an aisle, he froze. There, at the other end, was Denise Johnson, loading cereal boxes into her cart with her kids. His first instinct was to turn around, to avoid them entirely. But before he could move, Denise spotted him. "Mr. Henderson," Tyler shouted, waving excitedly. Tom gave a stiff nod, his heart pounding. He hadn't expected to run into them so soon, and certainly not here, in the middle of a store where he couldn't hide. Denise smiled politely, though there was a flicker of hesitation in her eyes. She hadn't forgotten how things ended. "Hey, Mr. Henderson," she greeted him, her voice calm but guarded. Tom cleared his throat, feeling his face flush. Hello." Tyler ran up to him, beaming. "Want to come over sometime and play football with us?" Tom shifted uncomfortably, glancing between Tyler and Denise. They still didn't hold a grudge. It was infuriating and humbling. "I don't know," Tom muttered. "I'm not around much these days." Denise studied him quietly, her expression unreadable. "Well, you know where we are if you ever want to stop by," she said, giving him a small, polite smile. Tyler grinned. "Yeah, you can come anytime." Tom gave another awkward nod and hurried away before he could say something stupid. His heart felt heavy as he left the store. How could they be so normal, so kind? The encounter with the Johnsons haunted Tom for days. He'd spent months making their lives harder, and now they still welcomed him like nothing had happened. The kindness unsettled him in ways he couldn't explain. He didn't deserve it, but something had changed. The bitterness that had once consumed him didn't feel as satisfying anymore. It left him empty, without the comfort of anger to shield him from his regrets. One afternoon, Tom found himself sitting on the steps of his apartment building, clutching a wrinkled sheet of paper. It was Marcus's phone number, scrawled at the bottom of a note they had left him before he moved. Just in case, the note had said. Tom stared at the number for what felt like hours, torn between his pride and the gnawing loneliness that had taken hold of him since the move. Could he call them? Would he even pick up? A few more days passed, and Tom tried to keep himself busy. But no matter what he did, watch TV, read the newspaper, wander around town, the feeling of emptiness followed him. One evening, after pacing around his apartment for what felt like the 100th time, Tom made a decision. He grabbed his coat, slipped the crumpled note into his pocket, and walked out the door. Before he could second-guess himself, he was in his car, driving back toward Maple Drive. He didn't know exactly what he would say, or even why he was going. All he knew was that he needed to try to at least acknowledge that things could have been different. When he arrived at the Johnsons' house, the familiar sight of the Halloween decorations, now long gone, flooded him with memories. This was where everything had started and where it had ended. He stood at the bottom of their porch steps, staring at the door, his heart hammering in his chest. For a long moment, he hesitated. Was he really going to do this? Was there even a point? Just as he turned to leave, the door swung open. "Mr. Henderson?" Tyler called from the doorway, his face lighting up with a smile. Tom froze, caught between the urge to flee and the strange pull of the boy's happiness. How could this kid still like him, after everything? Before Tom could respond, Marcus appeared behind Tyler. "Tom," his tone wasn't cold, but it wasn't overly warm either. It was measured, cautious. Tom cleared his throat, suddenly feeling smaller than ever. I just wanted to stop by," he mumbled, his voice barely audible. Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Stop by?" Tom shifted awkwardly. "Yeah, I wanted to say," he trailed off, rubbing the back of his neck. The words were harder than he expected. Finally, he forced them out. "I'm sorry. For everything. The notes, the complaints, all of it." Marcus crossed his arms, studying Tom carefully. "Why now?" Tom swallowed hard, feeling the weight of the moment. "Because I was wrong," he admitted quietly. "I don't know why I did what I did. I guess I thought if I made you the problem, I wouldn't have to face my own." Denise appeared in the doorway, her expression calm but guarded, just like Marcus's. They weren't quick to forgive, but they were listening. For a long moment, no one spoke. Tom stood there, exposed, vulnerable in a way he hadn't been in years. Then, Marcus gave a slow nod. "It takes a lot to admit when you've messed up." Tom let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Yeah, it does." Marcus exchanged a glance with Denise, then stepped aside. "Come in, Tom. Let's talk." For the first time in years, Tom felt a flicker of hope. A small but undeniable sense that maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to make things right. He followed them inside, the warmth of their home enveloping him. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a start. And for Tom, that was more than enough. Tom sat awkwardly on the edge of the Johnsons' couch, feeling like an intruder. The house was warm and welcoming. Family pictures on the walls, toys neatly tucked away in corners, the faint smell of dinner still in the air. It was everything Tom had tried to push away. And now, here he was sitting among the very people he had spent months trying to drive out. Denise offered him a cup of tea, which he accepted with a stiff nod. He hadn't expected their kindness to continue, but it did, without hesitation, without fanfare. Marcus sat across from him, watching quietly, giving Tom space to speak. But the words didn't come easily. Where do you begin when you've built a life on bitterness, only to have it crumble in front of you? "I guess," Tom started, rubbing the rim of the teacup nervously. "I guess I spent a long time thinking this place, this neighborhood, was all I had left." He glanced around the room, then down at the tea in his hands. "When everything started falling apart, my job, my savings, it felt like if I could just control something, maybe I wouldn't feel so lost." Marcus didn't interrupt. He sat quietly, letting Tom's words come out in fragments. "And when you moved in," Tom paused, swallowing hard. "I don't know. I thought if I focused on you, it'd distract me from everything else. I guess it gave me someone to blame." Denise leaned back in her chair, her expression calm but unreadable. She'd heard stories like this before, and they were always complicated, full of regret, excuses, and small steps toward redemption. "Look," Tom said, glancing between them, "I don't expect you to forgive me. I know I don't deserve that. I wanted you to know I see things differently now. And I'm sorry it took me so long." Marcus and Denise exchanged a glance, a silent conversation passing between them. They weren't the type to hold grudges, but forgiveness took time. "We appreciate you saying that, Tom," Marcus finally said, his voice measured. "But we're not just going to forget how things started. It takes more than an apology to fix what's broken." Tom nodded slowly. He hadn't expected anything more. "I get that," he whispered. In the following weeks, Tom found himself stopping by the Johnsons' house more often. Not for long visits, just enough to say hello, exchange a few words, or wave to the kids as they played outside. It wasn't easy. Every conversation felt like a step on shaky ground, but it was a start. Marcus didn't make it easy for Tom, either. Not out of spite, but because he wanted Tom to understand that change takes effort. Slowly, though, the tension between them began to ease, replaced by something that resembled cautious respect. Tyler was the quickest to forgive. Every time he saw Tom, he ran over with the same enthusiasm, waving and calling out, "Hi, Mr. Henderson," as if they had been friends all along. It was a strange feeling, being greeted with such genuine kindness from a child. One cool autumn afternoon, Tom found himself standing by the fence between their yards, watching Marcus rake leaves. The two men exchanged nods, and without a word, Tom picked up a rake from his own shed and joined in. For a while, they worked in silence, the rhythmic scrape of the rakes filling the air. It wasn't much, but it felt like something important, something Tom hadn't realized he needed. "Thanks," Marcus said quietly, after a while. Tom gave a small nod. "No problem." As the weeks passed, the once hostile neighbors fell into an unexpected rhythm. They weren't friends, exactly, but something had shifted between them. Something fragile but real. Marcus continued to offer small gestures of kindness. A plate of food when Tom's fridge was empty, a hand with a heavy box. And Tom, slowly but surely, began to reciprocate. He helped Marcus with the yard work, offered to babysit the kids once when Denise had to stay late at work. Each small act of kindness chipped away at the walls Tom had built around himself. On Thanksgiving, Tom sat alone in his apartment, eating a TV dinner. The noise from his neighbors' parties drifted through the walls, making the silence in his apartment feel even heavier. This was the life he'd created for himself, isolated and bitter. Just as he finished his meal, there was a knock on the door. He opened it to find Marcus standing there, holding a foil-covered plate. "Thought you might want some real food," Marcus said, handing over the plate. Tom blinked, overwhelmed by the gesture. He hadn't expected to be remembered on a day like this. "Thanks," he muttered, his voice rough. Marcus gave a small smile. "Happy Thanksgiving, Tom." Months later, spring arrived, and the world outside seemed to bloom with new life. Tom felt different too. The bitterness that had once consumed him had faded, replaced by a quiet sense of peace. One morning, he saw Tyler and Zoe playing catch in the yard. Without thinking, he grabbed a football from his car, a gift he had bought for himself, though he'd never used it, and walked over to the fence. "Mind if I join?" he called out. Tyler's face lit up. "Yeah, come on, Mr. Henderson." For the first time in a long while, Tom smiled, a real smile, not forced or bitter. He climbed over the fence and tossed the football to Tyler, who caught it with a gleeful laugh. Marcus watched from the porch, arms crossed, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. It wasn't an apology that had changed things, it was the actions that followed. As the game went on, Tom realized something that surprised him. He was happy. Not in the way he used to be, when control and pride ruled his life, but in a quieter, simpler way. He had lost his house, but in the process, he had found something far more valuable: connection, humility, and the beginnings of friendship. When the game ended, Tyler ran up to him, grinning from ear to ear. "You're pretty good, Mr. Henderson." Tom chuckled, feeling lighter than he had in years. "Not bad for an old man, huh?" Marcus walked over, clapping him on the shoulder. "Glad to see you out here, Tom." Tom nodded, a soft smile on his face. "Glad to be here." And in that moment, Tom realized that life didn't end with the loss of a house or with the mistakes of the past. It could begin again in the most unexpected places, because sometimes redemption wasn't about erasing the past.